Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I run through the current version of my Sunday sermon. This is the Sunday after Christmas 2019. I've never been very interested in the British royal family. I've always found the interest in them rather annoying. Why would anybody pay attention to these people? But I've been watching The Crown on Netflix and been quite fascinated with this series. I've appreciated the way that the series has managed to walk through 20th century history, but also the life stages of the characters in it. Now, how faithful it is to the history behind the stories, I don't know. There are plenty of websites and, in fact, books out there. It's a very popular series to follow. But I've been quite interested in it now, going through the third season. There's an episode in this third season called Dangling Man, which focuses a bit on Edward of Windsor. Now, for those of you who don't know anything about this history, in the 1930s, Edward of Windsor was king for just a very short time before he abdicated the throne. He abdicated it because he wished to marry a woman who was divorced once and working on her second divorce. She wasn't yet divorced from her husband when these two took up with each other. And the British society found this unseemly, and so they would not permit his marriage to this woman, and so he abdicated. Now this becomes a subplot through a number of the episodes in The Crown, because it's quite an interesting story where you have a king who gives up the throne for love. This is a very 20th century romantic theme, but how well does it go? Well, towards the end in this particular episode, you have the much older prince pondering the decisions that he made. We have these questions about how one ought to live their life through time and decay, and these tend to fascinate us. It fascinates us in terms of other people. It fascinates us in terms of people who have gone before us, and we ponder. A couple of weeks ago, I talked about the fact that we're these strange creatures that on one hand, we age and decay on the outside, but inside, so often, we are a story which doesn't decay. On the inside, I feel just as young as I felt when I was in my early 20s. I told a story about my grandmother about this, how even in her late 80s, she said, I feel like I did when I was in my 20s, but here I am trapped in this old body. So how do we spend our time? What is life about? What does life mean? It's very common in the Christian Reformed Church at the end of the year to preach a sermon on Ecclesiastes, because Ecclesiastes ponders these questions of value in life. We often think that more money, more opportunity, more time, more power somehow makes life more meaningful. And we find that, in fact, isn't the case, because the book of Ecclesiastes is a story about a man who has all the power and all the money in the world. And he explores life with career, with pleasure, with attainment. And in the end, he says it's all meaningless. It's hevel. Everything is hevel. And he tries to find, what's the conclusion? Where can you find lasting value and meaning in life? What do workers gain from their toil? I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from the beginning. We're not like our dogs or our pets that truly live in the moment. I hear that often, the admonishment to live in the moment. Well, my dog lives in the moment and he doesn't ponder for the future. But we worry, we ponder, we evaluate, we try to figure this out. My dog isn't really so much a story as I am. I have a story of my dog, but my dog isn't a story. My dog just simply lives. The eternity in our heart is so often our stories. I've been talking to various people over the last year about this meaning crisis. This is something that John Vervaeke, another scholar out of the University of Toronto, has been talking about. Where does this meaning crisis come from? Why is it? I had a conversation with him before I went on vacation, and he mentioned in this conversation Steven Pinker, who's one of these atheist enlightenment promoters who writes a book basically telling us how wonderful everything is. And John asks, if that's so much the truth, why does he have to write a book to convince us? What's with us? We're living at a time where we have more wealth, more affluence, more security than we've ever felt before. And we're more anxious and nervous and scared and uncertain, and meaninglessness stalks us. Now, I'll be in the lectionary for a while now, and picking some of the lectionary texts, I decided to preach, instead of the text that I usually preach on this time of year, I decided to pick the text out of Hebrews. I haven't preached that much out of the book of Hebrews. Hebrews is an interesting book because it's a book written quite clearly by a diaspora Jew, probably to other diaspora Jewish Christians, and he's trying to work out the meaning of Jesus' life, the meaning of what it means that Jesus would come to earth, what the incarnation would mean. And the book of Hebrews states that Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God. In fact, that's how the book begins. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets in various times and ways. But in these last days, he had spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things. Now, what you'll begin to notice is so often when we think of this term son, we think about it biologically. But more often than not, when the Bible talks about sonship in reference to Christ, he's not talking biology in the sense of the biology that we have, but he's talking about a legal and a royal term. The king would send his son. And so Jesus, being God's son, well, he's the representation. In the past, God spoke through prophets, but now he sends his Son to the world. And he appointed him heir over all things. That's what sons do. Sons inherit. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. That's very dramatic to say about a human being. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty in heaven. Majesty, capital M, meaning God. So he became as much superior to the angels as the name that he has inherited is superior to theirs. Now, what we're going to discover is that this angel business is quite complicated, and we're not really quite sure what's going on behind the scenes in the book of Hebrews. But the preacher in the book of Hebrews wants to make the point that Jesus is not simply some heavenly being, some immaterial spiritual being who takes on the appearance of humanity, but Jesus is in fact a true human being, and Jesus is in fact God. He's both. And that certainly is a challenging thing to produce. So he continues. For to which of the angels did God say, "You are my son, today I have become your father"? Or again, "I will be his father, and he will be my son"? God didn't just promote an angel. And again, when God brings his firstborn into the world, he says, "Let all God's angels worship him." In speaking of the angels, he says he made his angels spirits and his servants flames of fire. In other words, they're not material, not like Jesus, not like this man who had flesh. But about the Son, he says, "Your throne, O God, will last forever and ever. A scepter of justice will be the scepter of your kingdom." Now, in fairness to the psalmist that the preacher here is using, the psalmist, well, what did the psalmist have in mind? Well, the psalmist often speaks of the king of Israel, as God's son, very much setting up the relationship in those terms. And the angels he's speaking about, well, we're not quite sure what these angels are. In another book, Paul will speak about principalities and powers and other heavenly beings. And these, in fact, seem to be on the minds of the psalmist, as we'll see in a minute, but quite likely on the minds here. And what the preacher is making is that Jesus is fully man and fully God. And Jesus is not simply a spiritual being. He's wrestling with the expected answers to the questions of how can we regard this Jesus who came and his ministry? What is he about? Now, in the second chapter, he very much works on Psalm 8. And if you look at Psalm 8, I've edited this sermon a couple times in this series. Oh, now I'm pressing the wrong buttons. Hang on. See, it's a rough draft. I'm still figuring this out, especially this week, because it was a short week for me. But he's quoting Psalm 8. And there we go. He's quoting Psalm 8. And Psalm 8 is an interesting psalm because it ponders the place of humanity in the cosmos. And we look at the sky and we look at the stars and we wonder, where do we fit in? Now, Psalm 8 is a very popular psalm. Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory in the heavens. Through the praise of children and infants, you have established a stronghold against your enemies to silence the foe and the avenger. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is mankind that you are mindful of them, human beings that you care for them? Now, that's the NIV 2011 that I'm quoting. Those of you who remember the King James will say something like, what is man that you are mindful of him, singular. And this is going to be important as we go through. The Son of Man, that you care for him. Now, Hebrews is going to use this psalm, and he's going to use it in connection with these angels. But what are we talking about here? Is it not angels that he has subjected the world? It is not to angels that he has subjected the world to come. Well, what exactly does the author of Hebrews have in mind when he's talking about angels, about which he is speaking? But there is a place where someone has testified, Psalm 8, what is mankind that you are mindful of them, a son of man that you care for him? Notice how even the NIV is changing around the wording a little bit. And when you're preaching about quotes in the Old Testament and the New Testament, you have to pay attention to these details. You made them a little lower than the angels. You crowned them with glory and honor and put everything under their feet. But who are the them and who are the... What is he doing? Hebrews will ponder Jesus and how he fits into the drama. Now, if we look at the New Testament in Greek and compare it to the Old Testament in Greek, the Septuagint, you'll see that the New Testament author pretty much takes the Septuagint as it is. What is man? You'll notice in that you remember him. And you'll see over here on the left, I should probably label these. This is a very rough draft. Now what you'll notice, and now I use the LEB, an interlinear that comes with the logo software that I use, because it's sort of a handy translation to pull out and look at things underneath. What is man that you remember him, or the Son of Man that you care for him? That's out of, I didn't even label. Ugh, very rough this week. It's interesting what this is the LEB and all of the different stances. But what is a person that you remember him? They're treating Psalm 8 in the Septuagint. What is a human being that you think of him? And now what all these authors are dealing with is the question of inclusive language and how this should be rendered in translation, because there are Greek and Hebrew words that basically mean people, and there are Greek and Hebrew words that are gendered. And so in the Septuagint, what is a person? What an anthropos, and that's just a human being, not a man or a woman, but a person. And so they're trying to render these here. It's interesting that the NEB then in Hebrews uses man, and I think part of the reason they do that is because it's singular at the end of the sentence. What is man that you remember him? Although that's what they're dealing with there. But it's a collective. What is man, meaning humanity, that you remember him? And that's why the NIV will go with humankind, and the NRSV will go with a similar thing. What is man that you remember him, or a son of man that you care for him? You made him you made him for a short time lower than the angels, and you crowned him with glory and honor. So now if we jump back, we'll see that, well, this is Psalm 8. And what is he talking about? Well, of course, the psalmist, again, is talking about human beings in the context of the world and our royal ownership and rulership over the animals and the physical beings. And so we're lower than the angels, but we're above the animals. And you're seeing here a hierarchy of being that the psalmist asserts. Now, what's interesting is that you made him a little lower than, and if you look in the Hebrew, than the Elohim. Now, that's interesting. What are the Elohim? Are the Elohim angels? Or are the Elohim spiritual beings like principalities and powers that the Apostle Paul will talk about? But if you look again in the Greek interlinear, there will be angels. And so what exactly is the book of Hebrews talking about? What has Christ been made for a short time a little lower than. And you see here Psalm 8 about human beings sort of being, having a place in this chain of being above the animals, but lower than these heavenly beings. And now the preacher in Hebrews is working these issues in and saying, well, Jesus for a short time is made lower than the heavenly beings. And this very much is in keeping with Philippians 2. What is mankind that you are mindful of them, a son of man that you care for him? You made him a little lower than the angels, and you crowned them with glory and honor and put everything under their feet. Now the comment from the preacher. In putting everything under them, now notice the footnotes in the NIV, God left nothing that is not subject to them. Yet at present, we do not see everything subject to them. Well, what's he talking about? And what you'll notice is that there's a textual issue with them and him. And so the NIV decides to print them, but then footnote him, because quite clearly, the author of the book of Hebrews is preaching a sermon about Jesus. And in putting everything under him, it's ambiguous, God left nothing that is not subject to him, yet at present we do not see everything subject to him. So what does the book of Hebrews mean? Now he continues. But we do not see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, now crowned, but we do see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death. So we have Jesus, who is God and man, coming into the world, being made lower to these heavenly beings for just a little while, but because he suffers, he is crowned with glory and honor. That's an immensely new idea that continues to change the world. His suffering qualifies him for something, so that by the grace of God, he might taste death for everyone. I'll bring in all the conversations about Jordan Peterson. And Jordan Peterson, I remember in one of his biblical series, makes a comment about what is the one thing that an infinite God lacks? Well, by definition, limitation. God doesn't taste death, by definition. Another conversation between Jonathan Pageau and John Vervaeke. Jonathan Pageau, working out some of these issues with John Vervaeke, says at one point, the expression of the infinite is equal to the infinite. That's what the church councils declared. Well, what does that mean? That means that Jesus, being God, tastes death and suffers, and by virtue of that is now higher than all of the heavenly beings. Now, he was higher than all of the heavenly beings, and he now is seen as higher than all the heavenly beings. But what does that mean for us? In bringing many sons and daughters to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through what he suffered. Both the one who makes people holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. In other words, we become children of God. Or in the older translations, which again deals with this word son, we become sons of God. You say, what, I'm a woman. Well, the point is inheritance. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. What does the incarnation mean? It means this. He takes on our flesh, not so that we would avoid suffering or so that he would avoid suffering, but he changes our sufferings to be like his, as C.S. Lewis said. Continues. He says, I will declare your name to my brothers and sisters. In the assembly I will sing your praises. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, he says, here I am and the children God has given me. In other words, now, the author of the book of Hebrews, the preacher, is making the point that Jesus goes through this journey, God and man, and because he's God and man, he makes us and draws us into God's family in a very special way. since the children have flesh and blood, he too declared in their humanity, too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. What we see is that we are stalked. My dog isn't stalked by death. My dog doesn't, well, he knows what death is, but death isn't a concern for him in the future. He's just a dog. He lives in the now. The prince understands it, and the older prince wondering about the decisions that he made in his younger life. This fear of death stalks all of us. But where does it get its power, and why does the author of the book of Hebrews connect it with the devil? If we dip into a little René Girard makes the point that what is the kingdom of Satan? The kingdom of Satan wields control over this world by wielding the fear of death over us. And by this fear of death, we work on our bucket lists and try to accumulate. And we have the tension between eternity in our hearts and the ever impending doom that death brings, the decay of all things. Jesus breaks the power of that kingdom. For surely it is not angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants. For this reason, he had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God. This is what Jesus does for us. Servant to his Father, redeeming us, becoming flesh. This is sonship. And that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. He's a priest. Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. He is God, and he is one of us. Both. Now, where does this land us? Well, here we are. We wonder about death. We fear death. And that to the degree that we fear death, we remain subject to Satan's kingdom. But in his deliverance, the infinite takes on our particular flesh. He becomes one of us. He suffers what we suffer. He becomes subject to death in order to break that subjection for us and to bring us into his family. We are now brought into the family of God as Jesus' brothers and sisters. So what does this mean? As we ponder a new year, we feel time, decay, death as a cold thief, but a thief we ought not in Christ be concerned about. The devil's tool is the threat of death. The work of Christ frees us from all of this fear. That's what the book of Hebrews is telling us. And this is what we ought to receive into our hearts.